Hi, I'm Teresa Weezer, your host of 1 in 10. In today's episode, Siblings Divided, at Home and Foster Care, I speak with Dr. Dylan Jones, postdoctoral fellow at Penn State University. Now, over the years, needed attention has been given to what happens when a sibling group is removed from the home and placed in foster care, the way in which sibling bonds can be strained, and what can be done to support them. But until now, far less attention has been paid to those circumstances in which some kids are left in the home and some are placed in foster care. How common is that? What do we know about why some children would be placed and some not? What impact does that have on the kids at home and those that are out of the home and foster care? And most importantly, how does this affect the trajectory and outcome of all the kids in the case? I know you'll be as interested in this emerging research as I was. Please take a listen. Hi, Dylan. Welcome to 1 in 10.
My pleasure to be here.
So how did you first get interested in exploring the topic of what happens with siblings in foster care? Some part of the group is placed elsewhere and part of the sibling group is at home still.
When we talk about sibling separation in foster care, the typical example is when all kids are placed and they're all removed from the home, and then they are not all put in the same foster home. So for instance, popular legislation around that is the I think Fostering Connections Act 2008, and that only stipulates about that case when all kids are removed. When that happens, we need to case planning team to make these concerted efforts or reasonable efforts to place them in the same home. If that doesn't happen, we need to make sure that there's sibling visitation going on. So, for me going into this, I sort of had never really heard of instances, anecdotes, when it was the case when a sibling group was split because not all kids were removed, just some of those kids were removed. I'd heard of sibling groups being split around issues around adoption. But, I think it was just sort of a question that I had in the back of my mind, and I was unsure how often it was and sort of if there were sort of ramifications around that.
So let's just talk a little bit. Our listeners are child abuse professionals, but at differing, levels of experience. Talk a little bit about, what the reasons would be why some kids in a sibling group would be placed outside the home while others would be retained in the home. And then how common that is.
There's probably 4 general scenarios where this might be the case. One would be that all kids at the home are not subject to same maltreatment or abuse or neglect. So around the literature, you might hear of a term scapegoating. So one kid in the house is sort of the scapegoat and is uniquely targeted for abuse or neglect. Common example I sort of think is the movie Matilda in the 90s sort of plays that out a little bit. Another reason would be that all kids in the house, they don't all have the same vulnerability to that maltreatment. Let's say there's an infant and maybe the other kids are older teenagers. Neglect might be represent a particular threat to the safety of that infant, while it will perhaps affect the well-being of the other kids, but in terms of the immediate safety, I think that could be an issue. A third reason is it could be the case that not all the kids in the house have the same parents. So might be the case is perhaps some kids, they have different dads. And when CPS comes in, they're able to find a dad for some of the kids, but not for others. So it could be the case that all kids are in fact removed from the home, but they are not all formally placed in foster care. Now, unfortunately, this is sort of an issue it's hard for us to observe because unless they get that formal entry into state custody, we don't observe them as really from our perspectives as people who look at the child welfare system. And then lastly, it could be a case where you have an issue of voluntary relinquishment. So maybe there's an older youth with serious behavioral health issues or perhaps medical needs that the caregiver is unable to provide for, and they will voluntarily sort of place that youth into state custody while the other children may not present on those needs.
So you've talked about four categories of things that can kind of come up and that might result in this. Is this extremely rare? Is it extremely common? Just how frequently does this occur where you have some kids in the home and some in other placements, whether those are kinship care or foster care or something else?
To me, it's just sort of one of the bigger takeaways was that it was way more common than I had suspected. So 25% of the time, where you have a sibling group where at least one kid is removed, not all kids are removed. So, and that's sort of our lower bound estimate. You usually think of foster care placement as this family level, this caregiver level sort of need, right? And so it suggests that it's just simply not always the case, that it is not uncommon at all for these sibling groups to be sort of split, which we say in the paper, where there's sort of this partial sibling group removal, right? Some kids go to foster care and some kids stay at home.
Now, while your paper dealt with other things, which we'll get into in a moment, you just alluded to something a minute ago that I want to ask about, because I remember in 2008 when the law was passed and signed into law that required if all the kids were placed from a sibling group that they had to, have visits with each other if they were not all placed together. They had to make reasonable efforts to place them together, those kinds of things. And one of the side comments you made is, but that doesn't apply if some are in the home and some are outside the home. Did I understand that correctly?
If you look up the law, in the writing it is just referencing all youth who are removed. I'm certainly not a legal expert here, but it could be the case that kids who are left in the home while their siblings are gone, there is not the same sort of federal oversight or regulatory processes that would really sort of grant them the same rights of sibling visitations than kids who are all removed. That could be the case again.
That's fascinating. I had never picked up on that until you said it just right now. So, as you say, it's really a gap in the law, and especially given the importance of sibling contact with each other. But let's turn to your study for a moment. It seems to me that because of this gap in their literature, really, you were looking at some very fundamental questions, just trying to sort of explore what do we know about these kids? And so you looked at NCAN's data over a period of 3 years, and you had a series of questions that you were looking at. And so can you just tell the listeners, what specifically were you hoping to find out?
Yeah, so we sort of went in with three questions. First was, how often is it happening? So we observe a CPS report, and there's more than one kid named on it. How often is it happening when one kid gets removed? Not all kids are getting removed. That was sort of our first question. And that happens about 25% of the time when at least one kid gets removed. Right? Secondly, we were wanting to sort of dig into how those groups that we term they're split. Are they different than sibling groups who are all removed versus sibling groups who are never removed? The sibling group level sort of measures, and also the individual children themselves. And then third, we wanted to look at what happens about those kids who are left in the home, but their siblings are removed. Are they safe? Are they going to go to foster care eventually? Maybe they just weren't initially removed, conditional on that one index report that we saw. So those three questions were the major focuses of the paper.
Well, we kind of got ahead of ourselves a little bit earlier because I was so eager to dig in and already covered the first question a little bit. But let's talk about what you call in the paper split home group, where some kids are in the home and some kids are out of the home. I'm curious about what you thought you might find about those kids and what you did find about whether there were any differences and what those differences actually were.
So youth who are left in the home, whose siblings were removed. So we call those kids these split home kids, if they're in a split group, but they're left at home. Sort of depends who you compare them to. When we compare them to their siblings who were removed, they tend to be older. They're less likely to have their allegations of maltreatment substantiated. However, though, they still had high rates of substantiation. So it's not as though they were just sort of uniformly not being maltreated. Compared to youth in sibling groups where no one was removed, their rates of substantiation were way higher, even though they themselves were not removed. In a lot of other respects, there weren't a lot of differences when we looked at these youth characteristics. That was sort of a surprise too. In some respects, sort of a larger set of questions that maybe we need to sort of probe further on.
Yeah, I just even as you were saying that, I was thinking several things. So, one is your takeaway from that because the kids left in the home in these sibling groups, where I know for our listeners it's a little confusing. Just take it that largely we're going to be talking about sibling groups in which some are in the home and some are not. So, in those who were left in the home in that condition, was age the defining difference? I mean, if substantiation rates really wasn't, was it just that these are older kids? So even though there had been a substantiation, there was a feeling like they were less vulnerable or less likely to be at imminent risk of physical harm or something else. Like, what do you think that's about?
When we compare them to the siblings who were removed, they were older. So I think it's a mix of two things. One is they're older, so perhaps less vulnerable, and also less likely to have substantiated maltreatment when we compare them to their siblings who were placed. So when we sort of go back to the first question, are these sort of four reasons that might yield a sibling group to be split, right? They can have sort of different experiences of maltreatment, different vulnerabilities. I think it's sort of we find it's a mix of both, and probably depends on factors we might not be able to observe. But I would say we find general evidence of both of those instances happening.
Now, in the sort of third research question that you had, you really looked at these non-placed siblings. You were wanting basically to know if kids left in the home in that situation, were they at greater risk for re-report during specific windows? I think one of them was 30 days, and then you looked at a later period too. And then any future out-of-home placement. So I think, am I characterizing this correctly to say that one of the things that you wanted to know is, okay, we're keeping some of these kids in the home, but are they just bouncing right out shortly thereafter? So after the initial report, but we haven't solved anything by keeping them home initially because they're going to wind right back and out of home placement. Is that what you were trying to kind of get at?
Yeah, I think so. Like are these instances where the case planning was, there was some sort of lapse where, maybe they should have just been removed from the get-go.
Let's start with the re-reports first, because
Yep.
I think it's kind of interesting, the difference between the two. What did you find? Because it's a little bit complicated, actually, I think, what you found on re-reports. So share it with our listeners.
Absolutely. So for youth left in the home, kids left in the home, and for the first 30 days, they are at increased risk of repeated maltreatment when we compare them to kids whose siblings weren't removed and were also left in the home. That changes, though, after 30 days, or really, I think so, 6 months or more.
I think it was 6 months, yeah.
Yeah, they get then lower risk. And so you get the sort of signs change, the direction of this effect that we're trying to get at, which is always weird. And, we have some hypotheses of why that might be happening. Unfortunately, we're unable to strictly test them, though. So in some respects, our hypotheses of why that's happening are speculative.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit, because
Okay.
in a future study, maybe you will look at that. But
Yeah.
okay, so let's take that initial period. It's probably not surprising to people who are listeners, because they're child abuse professionals, that there would be some kids who'd be left in the home and the conditions would not have changed much. You know what I mean? And so maybe there's a repeat episode of physical abuse or neglect, and that gives rise to reports. I'm more curious about the 6-month kind of inverse relationship. And what do you think is happening in the home where, if 6 months go by and they've been in the home, they're much less likely to have a re-report? And our listeners understand. We're just speculating. I'm asking you your learned opinion here.
Foster care is perhaps, at least from the perspective of, child welfare assistant professionals, perhaps the caregiver gets their kid removed, and particularly for reunification, the caregiver is sort of, we require them to go through some services to get some of the kids back in their care. So, drug counseling, etc. So it could be the case that experience in the foster care system on behalf of the caregivers, right? The caregivers being experiencing
that's system, the constant, right? Yeah.
Create some stability in their care, and perhaps ameliorate some of the crises that led to initial maltreatment. So, yeah, like I guess I never really thought about it this way, but it seemed as though that those kids left at home almost benefited in the long term from their siblings getting removed, only in terms of that one repeat maltreatment measure.
I was going to say, this is a hot take, right?
Yeah, so very much just in terms of that, our one little outcome.
Yes, a re-report.
Yeah. It's an infinitely complicated situation. Exactly.
With all the caveats.
A whole bunch of caveats, please. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think there is something, kind of setting maybe that aside, there is something, I think, a little bit hopeful about the fact that all of the things that happen in these cases in that 6-month period, because a lot of services are front loaded, maybe some of it actually helps. That's one possible interpretation of the results you're seeing, is that, parent, as you say, required to go to substance abuse treatment, or maybe they have to have some kind of other intervention in the way they're disciplining their kids, or so that it's not abusive, or maybe their basic needs are being better met because now the system is aware and helping them access food, housing, clothing, whatever it is. And so it's interesting to think about, not because we think like foster care is so great or anything like that, but just that I think we do worry all the time, obviously, about the impact of that, and assume that kids who are left in the home, and there's a lot of discourse about that, may just be better off. And I think what you've painted is a much more complex picture in that equation, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of ways we can sort of measure well-being of the kids left at home. Re-report is one. It doesn't mean that they aren't getting maltreated, but maybe it's not reported. There's all sorts of things we're not observing. It could also be the case that, when we go to the beginning, we were talking about reasons why a sibling group could get split. Some kids go to foster care, some kids don't. Those kids that we are assuming, and this is a lapse, this is a limitation of the study, that those kids that we're assuming didn't go to foster care because there's no record of them formally entering state care. They could have been removed from the house and put in another household.
Kind of an informal rehoming, kind of. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay.
And we know very little about that stuff right now in the literature.
Yeah.
It's hard to
track because you're not necessarily aware of it, right? Yeah. And I think that folks who are listeners who have done casework or worked in cases are well aware that there are times when informally, like there was a placement with an aunt or whatever, and suddenly grandma has the kids, or mom had the kids, but actually grandma's doing a lot of caretaking of the kids, or these kinds of things, just informally. Let's talk about future out-of-home placement, though. This was another one where the data was a little bit complex for these non-placed siblings. So what did that look like?
So when we sort of define these split groups, so if a sibling group is split or not, that's just at a point in time. It could be the case that, in fact, all of the kids did get removed. It just didn't happen. It's not like it wasn't necessarily the case that they were never removed. Those kids left at home, and we find that to be to be happening a fair amount. So in that first initial 30 days, those kids who are left at home in a split group way more likely to get removed than kids left at home, but their siblings are also left at home. That increased probability drops off real quick. After 30 days, it's like 20 times as likely then, and then 30 days to 6 months, it's like twice, and then they're actually less likely to in the long run. And that could also be the case. I mean, I think that's could be the case that finding with regards to if they're placed in the long term or not, maybe similar to what we found in the re-report is if they get re-reported in the long term or not. That after a while, perhaps due to whatever family level services are happening, perhaps they're less likely to become re-involved in the child welfare system.
We don't know exactly what it is, but it's interesting to think about all the things that could make that be the case. One of the questions that child welfare is struggling right now with is sort of weighing all the factors, obviously, about the pros and cons of foster care for any given kid and leaving them in the home. And so much of that, I think, discourse has been around the probability of future abuse. And one of the things I was sort of thinking about in reading your paper is that first 30-day window is really a critical period for those kids that are left in the home, because you see this big spike, right? And then kind of a rapid drop off. So I'm wondering what you think the sort of the practice implications are, for the average caseworker sitting out there, and they've hung with us through all the research so far. What do you think the sort of practical implications are of this for someone who's, got one of these family groups right in front of them? They have a sibling group they're trying to decide what to do with. They have a case plan that they're trying to write up and get the court to agree to. What does this point them to, knowing this is just one study among many others?
Sure. I certainly, can't speak to, necessarily the best case planning practices in all these different scenarios. I think, one thing is it's sort of a reminder that when abuse and neglect happens in a household, it's often a sort of crisis. It's not some sort of state that occurs and then when it occurs, it's critical and perhaps it isn't temporary. That's we're responding to crises, not like permanent states of families. This study, it's in some respects, it opens up a bunch more questions than it answers. In order to drill down on real specific takeaways for case planning, we need to measure things that we just don't have in that data.
Yeah. So but you raise a good point. So for you, when you finished this, what research questions were still very clearly outstanding to you where you thought, okay, we've laid some interesting foundational data, but let's just say the money to do another study dropped out of the sky on us, what would be the next sort of building block to build on? The next set of questions that logically come to mind based on this?
We need to know why the group was split. So sort of going back to one of those four situations, and there might be more. I mean, I'm sure we can sort of theoretically think of more. That's sort of the crux of what we need to establish before we can really ask other research questions. We're sort of, some respects, operating in the dark, because if it's the case that a kid is being scapegoated, that they are the one that's being subject to maltreatment, perhaps the siblings are maybe contributing to it, and maybe it's good that that kid is not living with their siblings anymore. If it's just the case of one infant, one child is an infant, highly vulnerable, other youth, maybe they're older, they're not. I think that has its own sort of implications for case planning. So I would measure that. What was the rationale in the case planning for that case planner? Why did that occur?
Do you know any, and I just really honestly don't know myself, but do you know any state, or for those systems that are county based, that actually track that level of decision making? So, do you know anyone? Like, so when we talk about, a potential study and needing $1 billion for it, it's probably because coding that and trying to do that manually would be a yeoman's job.
Yeah, a lot. It would take $1 billion.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you know anyone who's currently looking at this or tracking it?
I don't.
Yeah.
Um, the only other sort of place in policy where I have seen these instances of these split groups come up, where some kids are left in the home, some kids are placed, is in some of these Family First Prevention Service
Yeah.
Act state plans.
Yeah.
So each of those in order to use Title IV funding, which is normally for foster care, in order to use it for preventing foster care, each state needs to submit a plan to the federal government saying this is what we're going to use the money for, these Title IV funds. In a lot of these states, they sort of have to define a candidate population. So we're not just going to spend it willy nilly on whoever may or may not go to foster care. We're going to target these kids, and one of those criteria are kids whose siblings are in foster care. And so I think in the paper we referenced some of these states, like Connecticut and California, maybe Kentucky was in there. Other states might as well be doing that. So those states may be, certainly in order to design policies to prevent those siblings from being placed, we would need to know what the circumstances were that led to them being split in the first case. So, I think so. Those states implementing these FFPSA, these Family First plans, that I think it's sort of ongoing. I don't know if they've, some states have started to, but my understanding is the implementation of FFPSA for these states it's been a slow sort of implementation. You think they'd be want to track that, sir? But to answer your original question, I haven't heard of any.
Yeah. Well, we'll hope that a listener who is connected to one of those states might just take that as something they'd like to take on. So, do you see any other policy implications of this research? Or if you had the ear of policymakers, what would you like them to do based on this research?
We want to make sure that the standards around sibling visitation are applying here to these kids, particularly those kids maybe left at home or placed. It's really I don't know if we have any like regulatory processes to sort of make sure that's happening. So sibling visitation when not all kids are in foster care. I think I'd probably put that would be sort of one of the next things on my list to sort of make sure that for in terms of the well-being of these kids, we're at least meeting that sort of necessary criteria.
So where's your research taking you next?
One limitation is that in national data, we don't really have we're not good at tracking sibling groups. We're good at tracking kids, individual kids. We have a kid ID, and we can look at them over years. But there's no family ID, and really any of the data we got. So, you might ask, well, how did you do your study? Well, we had to depend on report ID, so kids in a report. So, I think the next step is getting data, and we actually do have this in Pennsylvania. And my boss was just talking about it to me, the other day that we should start doing this. Is being able to identify biomom ID, and so seeing first if how well do looking at kids in a report, how well is that indicative or measure that they're in fact a sibling group? Are we leaving kids out, for instance? Maybe a kid was just staying there in the house for the prior month, and maybe isn't really a sibling in some respects. So we want to get better at measuring, I think probably siblingness, And so being able to identify a biomom is probably the next thing that next place we'll be headed.
Well, Dylan, thank you so much for coming and talking about a really important topic. We don't get to, unfortunately, cover research on sibling groups very often, so I was delighted to see this and look forward to seeing more future research from you on this topic. So thank you.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to 1 in 10. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend or colleague. And for more information about this episode or any of our others, please visit our podcast website at 1in10podcast.org.